Okay, so these are the principles of design, and once we're finished with this lecture, it will finish Unit 2, and you'll have everything you need to take test number 2. So the principles of design really are different ways we can use the visual elements together to create um, have different effects in our artwork. And this is a quote by Roy Lichtenstein. It says, "Organized perception is what art is all about." And basically, what he's saying is that every artist has the same toolbox. They all use visual elements, but how they use them all together is their own unique kind of signature. These are some of his works of art. He created large comic book strips, but they were huge, like the size of the wall on canvases, and he would use uh, primary colors like the comic books, and then Ben-Day dots, or like the little dots, to create the different values or tones to add the white with the between the dots. Now, when we talk about principles of design, we often use the word composition and design. And composition and design, they basically are kind of the same thing, but there's some differences. We could say composition is more used to describe two-dimensional art, such as painting, photography, drawing, etc., where design could be used to discuss 2D and 3D art, but also could to be described as a verb to that talks about making the art, like designing something. Now, like I kind of already said this already, but studying principles of design, they help us understand how to use the visual elements and create the right product that we want to create for the viewer. Principles are is another word to describe rules or guidelines, but really these are not rules. They're more just guidelines for artists to follow if they want to create a certain reaction or a certain theme in their work. And so these are the reasons why we study the principles of design. It helps us understand our own design sense. It helps us have a better vocabulary for talking about our art and talking about other people's art. And it also helps us to become more sensitive to all the communication that's present in works of art. These are the seven principles of design, and we're going to go through each of these. And mostly with these, you're just going to need to know the vocabulary, but there's a couple that you will have to be able to discuss, and we'll talk about that as we go through the PowerPoint. So, really, unity in art is the same thing that unity means in everyday life. It's where everything works together, and that's what we want in a work of art. But we also want variety. Variety is not a bad thing, variety is the diversity that's in a work of art. So, we want variety to have interest, and we just have to find the right balance. So, let's say you're making a work of art that's about the chaos and hardships of war. You probably don't want something that's super unified, right? So you may have more variety in that one, where maybe you want to make a image about childbirth and how beautiful it is. So with that one, you want more unity than chaos. All right, so it just depends on what it is that you're wanting to say. So I kind of just said this already. Too much unity could possibly be boring, where too much variety could be chaotic. So artists kind of have to find the right balance for themselves. Now, I just threw in some artists to kind of show how unity is in their work. Jacob Lawrence was an artist that was part of the Harlem Renaissance, which was a movement that took place in the mid 1900s after the Civil Rights Movement, where African American artists were trying to establish their role in the art world and music and writing and all of that. And he created this piece, and you can see it has a lot of unity. They're in a circle, which is a very unified shape. They're all kind of the same size being repeated. And then they're also contained in what looks like in a room with the use of one point perspective. And containing things also creates a sense of unity. So repetition creates unity as well as containing things. Also, we can see it's an achromatic color scheme because it's all neutral colors. And by using a color scheme, that helps unify compositions as well. And then we can see that there's a drawing of a plant that's growing. And so this all works together really well with the title, Brotherhood for Peace. So it's about people getting together, working together, and then it has a strong sense of unity. So that content and the form really go hand in hand together. Now, this is just another piece that he did. You can see this one definitely has more variety, but yet there's still some unity and organization to it as well. Sometimes color can be a little overwhelming, and so I often tell my students in my studio class to take a black and white photo of their artwork if it's in color, because sometimes you'll notice some of the other elements more. So I did that to Jacob Lawrence's piece, and you can see much more of the structure and the usage of the other elements like line and shape and some of the others. Because color, a lot of times we want to add more and more colors, but a lot of times maybe we don't have a good contrast of value. Maybe we don't have enough repetition of the same shapes. Maybe we have too much repetition. So color is not always the answer to fix our artwork. Now, this is a more representational painting from the Baroque era, and I just wanted to show you that you can use these terms to describe all artwork. And so here we see a lot of unity because they're contained, there's repetition of a lot of geometric shapes, and it looks like a believable scene. And we can see there's also variety as well as far as the size of the shapes, but also with the colors and the clothing of the people. And I put this one in black and white to show you again how you notice the other elements more when it is in black and white. Now, this artist used a lot of repetition of rectangles and squares with her photographs, but then when we look at them closer, we can see that they're parts of the body. And so conceptually, that makes us understand that they all belong to one thing, and that makes it even more unified with the content. We can also see they're all arranged in a circle, which we already said was a unified shape. So these are just some more examples. Here we have repetition of rectangles by Andy Warhol. We see different people, but then as you notice, it's all the same woman repeated over and over. So even though the photographs have variety because they're all different, and the color, there's some variety of color, we notice it's all the same woman, so that kind of helps unify it as well. Sometimes the idea may be very strong, but if the piece isn't visually unified, maybe it won't be as memorable or powerful. And this is an example of that. I really like this piece, but notice how everything's kind of the same size, and it's kind of hard to tell what to look at. And so visually, it's not very unified, but then when you look at the different depictions of the human body throughout history, it kind of makes you realize that maybe it's about measurements and things like that. Now, sculpture we can use to discuss unity and variety with sculpture also. And we talked about Alberto Giacometti when we talked about Mass. And here we're talking about unity and variety. And sculpture, like one of his pieces here, we can see the same line quality and the same texture all over the same thing. And another thing that makes it feel more unified is that it's balanced. And that's our next principle of design. Balance is the creating a sense of equilibrium. And we like balance in our lives because we are balanced. If you look at our bodies, we're pretty much symmetrical. And that is one type of balance. So symmetrical means that it's the same on both sides if you were to draw a line in it. And like I said, we find peace of mind with that type of balance because for the most part we are. However, a lot of people aren't. And so here you can see in this image, this is a guy's face and then two left sides and two right sides. We often have subtle variations, but a lot of people really strive to be symmetrical. This is a medical journal entry where a lot of doctors were talking about that they believe that the more symmetrical you are, the more uh, able you are to fight off illness, things like that, and the more attractive you're considered. And in Hollywood, we see a lot of symmetry, whether it's natural or plastic surgery. Some scientists believe that that's why some people become so successful is because we're attracted to the symmetry in their faces. And when I took art appreciation back in the 90s, in our textbook, there was a picture of Denzel Washington and Uma Thurman because according to this new facial scanning technology that they had in the 90s, they scanned a lot of celebrities' faces and they had the most symmetrical faces. And so they thought that had to do with their success. Since then, I've heard like Halle Berry has a perfectly symmetrical face. So does Britney Spears. So maybe, part of maybe the plastic surgery that people get. Maybe partly to be more symmetrical. And then we also see symmetry in architecture. A lot of government and religious buildings are symmetrical because that conveys a sense of balance and order and organization and also equality. Now, asymmetrical balance, that means that it's not the same on both sides, but it is balanced. So think about a scale or a seesaw. If you had a bigger kid and a smaller kid, that wouldn't balance out, but you could add several small kids to balance out the larger kid. And so that's basically what it's doing. It's creating balance, much like you would do on a scale. And there's different ways you can do that. And so these are some of those rules. And you can do the same thing with color, and I'll let you read over that. However, most people, they don't really think about a lot of this stuff. They just kind of feel like their piece is finished whenever it feels like it's finished or balanced. But when you're starting out as a student, it's helpful to kind of consider a lot of these things. And the main thing I want you to understand is that symmetry and asymmetry are both types of balance. So asymmetry doesn't mean it's not balanced, it just means it's not the same on both sides. So this would be an asymmetrical composition because it does feel balanced, even though it's not the same on both sides. The same thing with this one. It looks almost off balance at first, but then as you go through it, your eyes fixate on the red hat that kind of helps draw it out, and then you notice the sun up in the sky, which draws your attention to that side. Sometimes artists do create imbalance on purpose. Really, you don't see it that often in artwork because it makes you feel uneasy, but sometimes artists want to make you feel uneasy. So, in this piece about death and life, the artist was trying to show that there's more life than there is death, and so it feels a little imbalanced. Emphasis and subordination, that has to deal with our focal points, and emphasis is a focal point. There's not always a focal point or focal points in artwork, but sometimes there is. The subordinate areas, that would be the areas that are not as important, maybe the background. So in this painting by Chuck Close, we can see the emphasis is really right between his eyes, and it kind of radiates from there. As I said before, directional forces are sometimes implied lines or actual lines for our eyes to follow to take us to those points of emphasis or those focal points. And this painting by Francisco Goya about this horrific event that happened on the 3rd of May in 1808, where French soldiers drug Spanish civilians out of their homes and executed them in the street. No matter where you start in this painting, your eyes go right to the emphasis because of his strong use of directional forces. If you start at the top of the hill, your eyes go down across the bayonets and to the man with the white shirt on. If you start on the right hand side, your eyes go up the back of the men, the soldiers, down their guns to the man. Like anywhere you look, it brings you right to that figure. Contrast, this is also a principle of design. And the main thing I want you to understand, contrast doesn't just refer to value. A lot of times you hear people talk about contrast just talking about light and shadow, but contrast is any dissimilar elements put together. So you could have contrast by having a warm color next to a cool color, or by having wavy lines next to straight lines. So it's not just value, although value contrast is a thing, but it also can be other things that are put together. Repetition and rhythm. Repetition, we've talked about, is just repeating, basically creating a pattern. Rhythm is a word we associate more with music and things like that, but there is a sense of rhythm to art as well. And if you think about learning music, you learn to play from paper that has shapes and lines on it, and that tells you what to play. Dancers learn choreographed dance routines from dance cards that have shapes and things on it. And so we learn a lot of rhythmic arts through two-dimensional art. And so there is a sense of rhythm or movement throughout works of art as well that can be very calm or chaotic. And it's just like if you think about looking at a work of art and thinking of a genre of music to associate it with, it's kind of fun to think like that. In my design class, I have my students listen to instrumental music, and then they have to paint the music. And it's a really fun exercise to try to isolate all the sounds you hear and think about what color would that be? Would it be a line, a shape? What would it be going up or down or all around? Thinking about the movement. So anything visual has a sense of rhythm too. And this just talks more about what I was just saying. So, and we'll look at some artists' work and talk about the rhythm that's present. In a lot of Raphael's work, he was very soft with his edges. He rounded everything quite a bit. And so all of his work has this really soft, slow rhythm to it, as we can see with the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus here. The only hard edge that you'll see is in the crucifix that John the Baptist is holding, but everything is rounded and slightly exaggerated with this sense of roundness. And so that makes it feel very whole. Even her neck feels a little elongated, so it goes with the natural curve of the circle of the composition. Now, this artist wanted to create a sense of meditation in their work. And so you can see like these waves. People would have sat in front of this and imagined the turning of the waves, which would put them in a meditative state. And we call that alternating rhythm. The same thing with architecture, there can be rhythm. When I look at this hallway of these, uh, these columns, and you almost can hear the echo of sound going through the arches, and it makes you think of sound. Now, some people like to create chaos in their work and to create kind of a chaotic rhythm. And this artist, he did this. He painted a lot of murals on ceilings and walls of buildings. And this was around the same time as the artists Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo that we talked about before. And this artist, he got his big break when he got to do a huge mural for Dartmouth College in the United States. But in his work, we often see a strong central figure, and then in the subordinate areas, we see a lot of symbolism and other things as well. So it kind of feels a little claustrophobic, and there's a lot to look at. But in a mural, you can see that would be a really good thing. This is on the ceiling, and you can see the warm analogous color scheme and the movement of the man's arms. And then as you look all around in this kind of sense of chaos, you see sickles and hammers and swastikas, and you see this man fighting off the outside influences to Mexico at that time. This one here, you can see the epic of American civilization, and you can see all of the corrupt things that he saw in American culture, with church hoarding money, books used to prop up cannons, maybe like the idea that education is dead because people aren't being taught maybe what they need to know, countries stabbing each other in the back. We see these guys with masks on running through the streets that we could call gangsters. We also see women leading children that have no eyes, almost like they're blind to what's really going on around them, falling architecture. So pretty dark outlook to life at that time. But this was during the World Wars and also the Great Depression. This piece he did, it's very powerful. And again, a warm color scheme, analogous color scheme, and filled with all kinds of stuff. But we could see in the background, there's just all these weapons of destruction, and then there's all these all this religious symbolism, and Jesus standing in the front. But it doesn't look like Jesus at first. It almost looks like Rambo. He's like a warrior, and this seems so ironic to the stories of religion and of Buddha and Jesus and what peaceful people they were. But here he looks like a warrior. And the whole idea of this was to create a juxtaposition of the idea how a lot of people use religion to fuel wars, but really they're meant to be peace and turning the other cheek and forgiving each other and being helpful to one another. So when we see religion being used in the name of violence, it seems very strange. And then the last principle of design we're going to talk about is scale and proportion. And both of these have to do with size. And the way that I remember scale from proportion is scale starts with an S, and so does separate. So scale refers to separate objects being compared to each other, where proportion, it starts with a P, and so does the word parts. And proportion means that parts of a whole are being compared to each other. So if I were to say, like, a bottle of water is smaller than a television, that's talking about scale. And if I were to say that the buttons on the television are smaller than the screen, that's referring to the proportions of those parts of the television. So it's important to know the difference between those words. Now, format is another word that has to do with size and scale. Format refers to the actual size of the work of art. So, in this class, looking at your textbook and the PowerPoints, you're really not seeing anything to its true size, and so that format distortion can affect your understanding or the character of the work of art. So that's why often it's important to see the work in person, because seeing it in the format and the scale of it in real life will make it even better, usually. And one instance in one of the textbooks that I teach from, it has this little self portrait of Rembrandt right next to the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And I have a link here if you want to see what the Sistine Chapel looks like in person, but it's larger than a football field. And it's on a ceiling that's like 100 feet up in the air. And so when you see those almost the same size in a textbook, it's kind of weird because in real life it's so much different. So, like I said, it's always best to try to see things in person if you ever get the chance. Now, one artist, he played with scale quite a bit, and he made really huge objects that were really small things in real life. And so he distorted the scale to make it kind of whimsical and fun. This is one piece he did. It's these shuttlecocks, like the little game pieces from badminton, and he made them to where they were like the size of a building. And so it's kind of playful. It makes you feel like you're walking through like a giant's playing ground. Here he made lipstick on top of a tank, and so you can see the lipstick's huge. And so this kind of is playful and fun. And this was made during the Vietnam War, and it was meant to go along with the slogan at the time. It was "Make Love, Not War," that a lot of the hippies had come up with, and they put this on a college campus to kind of protest the war. Here we can see this large clothespin that's made out of steel, and you can see a man sitting below it. So you can see the sculpture is multiple stories tall. And you may think, why would somebody make a huge clothespin sculpture? But if you remember to those two kiss sculptures that we looked at earlier this semester, that's what inspired him. Is he saw a clothespin one day and thought it looked like two people kissing, and so he made a big sculpture to kind of make that statement even bigger. So now you'll never look at a clothespin the same way again. Here's a big flashlight that he put on the University of Las Vegas, Nevada's campus, because they're known as the City of Light, so it kind of plays with that idea. This one used to be in the Dallas Museum of Art. They still own it, so it's in storage, but it was a really big stake that looked like it was going into the ground with a rope going up to the ceiling. This is a big spoon that is a bridge and also a functioning fountain that I think this is in Cincinnati maybe. And then this one's in Denver, Colorado. It's a big broom and dustpan and those are real people that are standing in front of it. I took this photo when I went there a few years ago. So his pieces, he distorts scale to just make it kind of fun and playful. And then next I wanted to show you a few sculptures by Michelangelo. And Michelangelo, he painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling. However, he wasn't a painter. He didn't really want to paint that ceiling. The Pope actually made him. What he loved doing was sculpting marble. And he had the ability to see just a block of marble and see the figures in it without doing any sketches, which is really rare. Like most artists have to plan a little bit. And he had to plan for his paintings, but for his sculptures, he would just start carving. And when you think about carving marble, like marble is such a durable material, we make our countertops and our floors out of it. It's not easily chipped or carved. And so, how these people, before the invention of electricity, before the invention of pain medication, how they were able to carve with just a hammer and a chisel and a grater, like it's very impressive that he could carve from large marble and make things that look like weightless fabric and flesh. It takes your breath away when you see it in real life. And he once said that he thought he had a gift from God, that he was able to release these figures from the stone, that God gave him the ability to see them. But later in his life, he lived to be 80 something years old. because he was working out every day, basically hammering marble. But you can imagine 80 years of sculpting. His hands were all filled with arthritis. His hearing was all messed up because he would just hear clanging all the time. And so it messed with his hearing. And later in life, he said that his gift of sculpture was actually a curse to teach him a lesson that he wasn't a god, that he was just a man. But either way, he made beautiful pieces. And this is one of his pieces called the Pieta. And it's over 5 feet tall, and she's sitting down. So you can imagine it's larger in scale than people are in real life. But then, if you first notice it, you probably, whether you know the story of the religion or not, it's really sad just to see someone holding a dead body in their arms. So it kind of makes you feel empathy right away. But if you know the story, it's supposed to be Jesus after he was crucified, and she's holding his dead body. And when we look at it at first, you just feel sad of this woman holding her dead son. And you don't really notice that the proportion and scale is off. But if you look closer, Jesus is a lot smaller than Mary, and he was in his 30s, according to the Bible, when he was killed. And so it's kind of odd that he's so little. If you look at her lower body, it's huge. If she were to stand up, her lower body would be almost double the size of her torso. And so he altered the proportion of her body to support his body. And also they made him smaller. They made Jesus smaller, so it looked like Mary was holding her child. And so it's so subtle you don't notice it at first. But even if you look at her hand on his back, you can see her hand is huge compared to his back. And maybe that's to symbolize her strength. And one of my theories is if you look at her face close and you look at his, she almost looks younger than him. And she doesn't look scared or sad. She almost looks like she's looking at a newborn baby with awe. And it makes me wonder if maybe this isn't about Jesus' death at all. Maybe this is about Mary's strength and that moment that he was born, and she knew what he was going to be. And she was maybe thinking about how is she going to let this little baby grow up to have this fate. And so it makes you wonder if Michelangelo was a lot more symbolic and expressive in his work than a lot of people give him credit for. But either way, it's a beautiful piece, and that's one solid piece of marble. So how he carved two people connected and made it look like this, it's really impressive. But I think he may have altered Jesus' size and made Mary's lower body bigger to make it feel more like a mother holding her baby. Now, this was a Pieta sculpture made before Michelangelo's, and you could see in the 1400s, and you could see that they're more proportionately accurate, but it doesn't really give you the same feeling. When you look at these two side by side, to me, by altering the proportion and scale, Michelangelo's, it feels much more like a mother and a child. And so I think that it could be important to play with scale and proportion to get your piece of art to have the effect that you want it to have to the viewer. Now, another statue by Michelangelo is the David. And this is another story. The biblical story is about a little boy that defeated a giant. But here we have the boy is over 17 feet tall. So why would Michelangelo make the little boy the giant? And I think, again, it's meant to be symbolic. He's also doesn't look like a little boy because he's got abs and pecs of marble. And his hands are really big. Again, I think he altered the proportion of the hands to symbolize the strength that he didn't know that he had, that God had given him to defeat the giant. And then his nudity is to show his vulnerability and his innocence. And so again, I think Michelangelo kind of plays with the symbolism and the details from the story to make us see a different side of it. Now, as I said, Michelangelo's David is over 17 feet tall. This is one by Donatello that was done before Michelangelo's, and this one's only about 5 feet tall, so it's much more accurate maybe in terms of scale. But we could see here that David is standing on top of the giant's head, and so this would have been after the battle, after he had decapitated him. So a different part of the story. Now, after Michelangelo's sculpture, we had So seeing them all side by side, again, Michelangelo's would be about double the size of all of these because it's 17 feet tall, where the others are more life size. And then the last thing I wanted to show you is that nowadays, a lot of artists, if you go on Instagram, you'll see them post different pictures of different stages or progress pictures of them working on their art. And before photography was easily accessible or even invented, artists couldn't always do that. But even when it was invented and it was just black and white, it didn't really help to photograph the stages. However, Matisse thought it did because he would change his artwork so much from when it first started to abstracting it that he wanted to go back and see what he did. And so he was one of the first artists to start taking photos of different progress stages to show the viewer. And in this one painting that you see on the right, he actually photographed that painting over 24 times as he was working on it. So a lot of people give him credit for doing that and making that a thing that people do today. So this concludes the Unit 2, and now you should be ready to take test number 2. Make sure that you look at the study guide and you go back and look at the book for anything that doesn't make sense.